How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 275 of Master My Garden podcast. So, this week's episode is an exciting one. So, up in County Wicklow, there's a project ongoing called Wildacres Nature Reserve, and it was started by Brian O'Toole and Gilly Taylor. And it's a fascinating place. It was actually I had heard about it about a year ago and have since been following on Instagram. It's, I believe, about 18 acres, but it has 52 ponds, has 15,000 native trees planted over the last few years, has 4 acres of wildflower meadows. I have about a 400 square meter wildflower meadow, and I think I'm great, but there's 4 acres of this here. And it has become an education center, a nature reserve, and there's loads of ongoing workshops that are going on all through the summer. So things like how to create a wildlife pond, which we speak about on the podcast and have spoken about on the podcast before. There's ones on beekeeping and loads of sort of related workshops as we go through. But it's a fascinating project. There's what has happened in the transformation we're going to hear about now in a minute, but it's like, what I've said with my little wildflower meadow, when you create an environment or a habitat, the wildlife will come. And I've seen that with my first pair of bullfinches that I keep harping on about on the podcast. I've never had them before, and they have come in as a result of it. So if you can imagine just scaling up that and the amount of different wildlife that will come in off the back of that, it's amazing. So Brian and Gilly, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
Oh,
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to meet you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so it's a fascinating project. I suppose the first place we need to start is where exactly this idea or brainchild, or what was the catalyst for the idea, and
Right.
and then we'll start
Yeah.
to move through.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll start because Brian doesn't like talking about himself too much, so I'm gonna start on that one because I'm gonna tell you about the wild child that he was, literally.
Yeah. So make me sound like a rock star.
Well, wild child from a nature point of view.
So
So
TVs at the hotel window.
that's really where it all started, I suppose, with Brian as a child growing up in Dublin. And Cabinteely had access out the back of the garden through a gap into a native woodland with the meandering stream through it. And you really just as a youth were just drawn to nature and spent your time in that. And I'm always fascinated, like listening to this as a story growing up, and I had a couple of siblings that might never have set foot in the woodland, but he was one of those children that was naturally gifted with this draw to nature and wanting to find out more, and upturning stones, finding out about the bugs and creatures that are there, and rescuing jackdaws and badgers and any animals that are in trouble. And to spend that time immersed in nature as a small child and obviously back in the day, you had a lot of freedom that you weren't being there wasn't the helicopter parent day, there was sort of, he was allowed to spend time there alone and really just immerse in nature. And I think from there it kind of grew with you, constantly reading and watching David Attenborough and Jacques Cousteau and books and encyclopedias, going to the library. So that love of nature was always there. And I think that's really where the journey began for you. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, I mean, listen, thank you. I take the naturally gifted bit. I tell you what, that doesn't come off. But look, listen, it's been, I mean, and it is often something I wonder about, are we born with a love of nature, or is it something that develops? And I think sometimes you can be born with it, definitely. I remember as a kid, since could walk, being fascinated by nature. But I mean, even you yourself, Gilly, I mean, you've always been you grew up, we're both from South Dublin. You grew up very local to here as well, and you were always into the outdoor life. And Gilly's a ski instructor, and it's always been into outdoor pursuit, trekking and skiing. And just in the last, since we bought the land, we had this desire to maybe buy some land and change direction. We both had in corporate careers for 30 odd years. And we just saw the biodiversity crisis and interlinked climate, they're totally inseparable. Climate crisis unfolding, and we just want to do something to do the best we can and have an impact. And that was to buy land. So, and as I said, Gilly just has become you've become completely immersed in it. And it's just mesmerizing as to how much it's 24/7, in relation to the immersion in biodiversity and your study of biodiversity. So
I think it's interesting to think, though, that there's two very different examples. So Brian, who was naturally drawn to it and learned about it, our native flora and fauna since he was a small child, and continued that all the way through his life. Whereas for me, while always interested in the great outdoors, I never delved into the detail of the flora and fauna, and in school you didn't really get that, other than the nature table in junior and senior infants. It didn't continue on throughout school, so I didn't. But in the 7 years since we started with when we got the land, I suppose have been, as you said, Brian, I've been studying it.
Well,
every day and day.
It's not just study, you've been infatuated, you've been
absolutely love
totally
it.
drawn to it,
Totally drawn to it, and kind of feel that it's never too late to learn,
No, that's the great thing, actually.
Yeah.
And no one knows it all. That's the other great thing. I mean, you don't have to know the Latin names of every plant and every animal to have, to be totally awestruck by the beauty of the biodiversity we have here in Ireland. And that's something we really try and impress upon people. Not impress upon them, that's the wrong term, but show them. And we do show it to people that come down to us. We have stunning biodiversity. I mean, just the weekend, we did Creating a Wildlife Ponds workshop. And as part of the workshop, we do a pond dip beforehand, before the attendees come down. And we put all the wildlife out in trays on the table and show people as to what's in the ponds, and they're totally blown away when they'll see water scorpions and dragonfly nymphs and newts and tadpoles and water boatmen. There's just so much biodiversity there, and we show them videos of kingfisher we've taken coming in and fishing off the perch in one of our main ponds, and a pair of otters coming up on the trail camera, coming in from pond to pond, hunting for frogs, and there's just so much incredible biodiversity there. So it is something, and that's just leading on from that train of thought. You don't have to have grown up in that environment to fall in love with it and fully appreciate it and open up a whole new area of your life, in relation to what's out there beyond the front door and the back door to enjoy it. And you don't have to have acres of land either. Even a small garden, you can attract in biodiversity and be blown away by it.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get to that, how people can sort of do their little bits in the garden. But something interesting there struck me as you were having that, and I started thinking to myself, you were drawn as a small child to nature, and your siblings less so. And I think one of you asked the question, is it a case that certain people are drawn to it and others not so much? And I wondered that as you were talking there. I have a 16-year-old and I have a 6-year-old. Both of them love nature. Both of them are, like the outdoors more than indoors. But strangely enough, the 6-year-old has an unbelievable desire to know stuff about animals, about insects. And I think for me here, it becomes very obvious. So, sometimes when the weather is bad or whatever, and they can't get out, or particularly she can't get out, she can get a little bit pent up in herself, and we just look at one another and we say she needs to get outside. Within 10 minutes of being out in the polytunnel with me, or within literally minutes, she completely changes. Everything relaxes down.
Amazing.
She's digging up as you guys mentioned. She's digging up all types of little creatures. She creates little homes for them. And it's amazing to see. But
isn't it?
I think life in general creates a disconnect, whether by design or not, I don't know, but it creates a disconnect between us and nature. And I think it's massively important that that connection is maintained. It's good for us, obviously, there's the
huge,
obvious
huge
health benefits, mental health benefits, all those things. But I do think that there is certainly, with my two kids, there is, the younger girl has an innate attraction, and I don't know, that's built into her to nature and animals.
That is fascinating. But I mean, I do 100% believe that you certainly can. You could grow up all your life not having that interest, and you can develop it, and it can, a spark. It's like a seed germinating. Something can just,
Yeah.
take. And then all of a sudden, you just find yourself becoming more and more and more interested. I mean, you're a great example of that. I mean, I'm not saying, of course, you were always interested in nature and you appreciated it, but you just love it so much now, and you're so involved and so interested in learning more constantly, in relation to it.
But I definitely think sort of outdoor recreation is a gateway to learning more about nature that's within that outdoors. And I think that's where the piece that's missing in our schooling system is that we don't have that threaded throughout our education, and it should be part of every school day throughout all of our 14 years that we're in school, and that, that like, I mean, I'm always fascinated by the fact that I was in my early 50s before I learned what the 28 native trees are in Ireland, I thought sycamore was native, I thought beech was native. So all of these things, where sometimes as a kid there was inaccurate information and then there wasn't enough of the right information out there. So I think if you have that knowledge, because you really can't, you don't love something until you know it and are able to name it, and you won't protect it unless you care about it. And that care comes from knowing its purpose, knowing how it interacts with other creatures or other flora and fauna together. And I think that's where, if we're missing that knowledge, the great outdoors can always just seem like nice to see. It's an aesthetic
for the weekend,
rather than an understanding. So I had that, loved the aesthetic, being out climbing, hill walking or whatever, loved the aesthetic. Yes, the bird song, but didn't have that connection with the importance of knowing what these creatures and plants are and how they interact together and how each one of them is important. Like the Jenga blocks. You don't want to, if you start pulling out pieces, the whole ecosystem comes crashing down. So
it's funny, we said this conversation could go in any directions. Education is one that I often talk about. And it's interesting when you say that about the nature, and in a time where we do have so much in terms of down the line trouble in mental health issues and all those sort of things, a connection to nature gives people a grounding, and it doesn't solve those issues, but it certainly paves the way for a calmer future, I would say. And I kind of tie gardening in with that as well. So,
absolutely,
from an education point of view, for kids to understand where proper food comes from and how to grow that proper food. And it has everything. It has the natural benefits of being outside. It has mathematics in working out, spacings and what goes where. I think it really does have everything, and nature is the same. And if you're able to intertwine those together, it's certainly, I think it's something that should be in every school, in every country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, it should be so much more focus on it. But I mean, we talked, in relation to the pandemic, for instance, the COVID, and that was a great example, and everybody's aware of that, how all of a sudden with everything, the cessation of everything and everything stopped, people were just, all of a sudden we're outside, they're in the parks, their gardens. And, it used to be a bit woolly in relation to, nature and itself, the benefits of it, but it's now proven, it's out there in science, it's been studied in such detail. I mean, I know in the UK, the NHS will actually prescribe, green therapy, and people prescribe people to go in certain circumstances, of course, to go to be in blue spaces, around ponds, lakes, rivers, or to go out into, green spaces, woodlands, parks. It reduces our cortisol levels, our stress levels. And, and I think, in relation to woodlands, been proven that going into woodlands, spending a certain amount of time will actually boost your white blood cell count. The terpenoids, I think they're referred to, or they're called, the trees release. So it's scientifically proven now at this stage. So absolutely, so good.
Studies about recovery as well from people who have been in hospital having an operation, that the recovery, they've done studies that the recovery is faster if they have access to viewing green space, so out a window, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a window. It could be a massive big ceiling to floor mural of woodland, and that people who had access to that for the few days recovered quicker than the people who had just four plastic walls. And
there's amazing research, and actually, speaking of which, we're going to come on to now soon, wildflower meadows. There was quite a good study done in Germany in relation to the vapors or the scents that come off a wildflower meadow, and how they increased, dopamine levels, and people were naturally happier in the vicinity of that. And it was a proper study, and the evidence was fairly compelling that people were just happier in and around that environment. It was amazing.
As opposed to sorry.
Yeah, so we'll start to chat about, I suppose, the changes and the progress. So you bought this plot of land, both coming from a corporate background, both with interest in and concerns around biodiversity collapse and climate crisis and all these things. And I presume when you bought it, it's green fields. Is there anything there to start with, or what was the initial?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, and it's always good, I think, to set a baseline in relation to the biodiversity. I mean, I mean, we were hugely concerned and are hugely concerned in relation to biodiversity in Ireland and worldwide. But I mean, because quite often we get perception out there is that we live on a lovely green island and everything is green and we're wonderful, and But I mean, just to give a fact, or throw a fact on it or some figures on it. I mean, in 2018, the London Natural History Museum conducted a study of biodiversity intactness, as in the state of native biodiversity in 240 nations worldwide. And Ireland came out 13th worst in relation to the 240 nations. So we do spend a lot of money in Ireland on curating a wonderful image of a green nation, but in relation to our biodiversity, it's in a bad state. So now it's not all doom and gloom, because there's a lot of things beginning to happen, and there is definitely a major swing in public perception or public willingness to act. So
and the other one is, since the 1970s, we've lost 50% of our biodiversity in Ireland. So even if you were to just take those, few decades, there's that much has been lost.
So we've lost a huge amount.
So there's a lot to gain in terms of to stop that continuous decline, because it's still declining. So there's a lot to gain from stopping that and then reversing it. And build it and they will come. I mean, nature is very forgiving. Once you bring the habitats back, it will respond positively. And that's the beauty of it. It's not rocket science. The solution is not rocket science. It's really straightforward. And it's a case of taking the action, and we can make a difference. Everyone can make a difference.
And that's the great thing. And I mean, it's now really, and it was put very succinctly there recently. We were at a conference down in Fote Island there, and it was said that now is the time for action. We have all the reports. I mean, Ireland declared a biodiversity emergency in the Dáil back in 2019. But nothing really happened concrete since then. It was sounded great and made great news. But now we have all the reports and the studies and whatever else. And now is the time where we need to start restoring biodiversity. And the great thing is that everybody can be involved in restoring biodiversity in their own way. So it's not something that's beyond the reach of people with back gardens, front gardens, courtyards. Everybody can play their part in doing that. So
I do think that, I suppose, COVID played a part in that. While the emergency was declared in 2019, then we had the COVID emergency that stalled things for a bit. But then things started happening more and more. And, there is a lot going on. I mean, if we were to go back though to our own example, because you asked about the blank canvas, the land back in 2017 when we got it was literally 4 fields of just perennial ryegrass. It had been very heavily grazed by sheep, and there had been cattle on it as well. But mixed farming, the way it used to be done back in, say, the 70s, where there was a few cattle, a few sheep, a little bit of everything. Biodiversity was able to live amongst that. Intensive agriculture then has caused a depletion of nature. And I suppose that's where we found it, was 4 fields, just grass, nothing else. The perimeter hedgerow was okay, that was reasonable. But so that blank canvas gave us an opportunity to say, right, what are we going to create with this? How are we going to write this story? And I think the urgency was really a case of bringing habitats back, but a variety of them. I mean, we could have easily just planted the whole lot with just trees, blocked out the deer and sort of let it do its thing. But then we kind of felt that we wanted to be part of it on an ongoing basis. So, we started digging ponds, planting trees, planting hedgerow, thinking about wild meadow. How could we create a wildflower meadow? And it's sort of evolved from there. So you could say that in one aspect, we made it up as we went along.
Yeah.
And I think the land appreciated that, because we didn't rush in. I mean, the one thing we always advise people to always assess a habitat. If you're going to create a pond, for example, rather than just go start digging, make sure you're not destroying a biodiversity rich habitat in order to create another one, and we might be very discreet looking in terms of very delicate wildflowers that are very, unique and rare. So to always make sure. So we started working straight away.
We started working on the land, and we've learned a lot over the years. We've made some mistakes along the way, and we happily share those mistakes with people that come to us so they can avoid making the same mistakes. But overall, it's worked out. It's worked out well, and it's been heartening to see biodiversity come back definitely to the land, and to get the responses from people that have come down to us. Because I mean, what we set up with obviously Wildacres, it's a social enterprise. So, and the mission really is to help restore biodiversity, and try and inspire and help as many people as possible to do the same in their outdoor space, whether it's a courtyard or whether it's, and we get people of all walks of life coming to us, people that have, that have an apartment and a balcony, and they want to plant some wildflowers into a pot and create a tiny pond. Or we've had people with hundreds of acres who are large scale, working to restore biodiversity, and of course everybody in between with gardens of every size.
Yeah, we'll sort of move back to the Wildacres again, and and then we'll stitch that into how people can sort of do this in their own gardens. But you mentioned, so you have a variety of different habitats now. You've from reading your website, you have 52 ponds. Is that right?
57 actually.
57. There's more.
Every time I have my back turned, pond. I can't keep up with the updating it on the website.
So 15,000 native trees, or maybe more.
No, that's about right. Still,
4 acres of wildflower meadows, and so maybe tell us about those. Like the trees were the first thing, I guess.
Yeah, well, actually, just a correction as well, because it's 34 acres we have now, but we actually signed off last month on another 16.36 acres
of
land, or 16.5 acres of land, which is only a few hundred meters away from the original site. So again, for biodiversity.
Brilliant.
So the individual habitats on the land, as Gilly said, I mean, we were lucky as well, we should mention, we have the Red Cross River, which borders the nature reserve. So that was a real bonus to get that as well. So that brings so much more wildlife in. But it was heavily grazed. I mean, it was all the vegetation had been stripped away, especially along the river's edge, which was a real problem, because that's such a sensitive area. That what they call the riparian corridor, which is basically just the transition from the aquatic habitat to the terrestrial habitat. That strip of land had been stripped of vegetation, and that brings with it all sorts of problems. Because wildlife will use that corridor to travel along and to forage in. It's a really important habitat. And without the trees, reinforce with the roots of the trees, reinforcing the riverbank. There was massive erosion problems along the river. So we did a huge amount of work, myself and Gilly, on that, in restoring the riverbank and replanting that riparian corridor with native trees. We also then, as I said, the wildflower meadow, we have a wet wildflower meadow, 4-acre wildflower meadow. This is on the original site, which we mostly let regenerate itself, but we also collected local wildflower seeds and plug planted some wildflowers in to increase the diversity. Because obviously, with our land changed the way it is all around us, you haven't got that seed bank necessarily there all around to repopulate with a diverse range of wildflowers. So, for instance, we grew Devil's Bit scabious from seed and plug planted it in, quite a lot of oxeye daisy. And then the most famous one, obviously, is yellow rattle, which we sowed in, otherwise known as the meadow maker, which is a wonderful wildflower for anybody creating a wildflower meadow. It's fairly generalist. It'll grow in most soil types, wet, free draining. But the crucial thing, obviously, it does is it's what they call hemiparasitic. So it'll tap into the roots of surrounding grass and draw nutrients from them, thus obviously weakening the grass and giving a chance for more delicate wildflowers to grow through.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to mention on the new land is very different. So the new land is actually mainly dry. So it's probably, again, we haven't got stuck into it just yet. But we're already out the door busy. But that 16.5 acres, a lot of that will be wild meadow. Actually, we're looking at the idea of conservation grazing on that. That meadow. We've certainly started by putting in some perimeter hedgerow, and there'll be some stands of trees as well. But a lot of that is ideal for wildflower meadow.
Yeah.
And yeah, so.
And that'll be a different wildflower meadow. And we speak about wildflower meadows quite a lot on the podcast. As I say, I have a native one that we've sown here. And I know no mow and just let things grow is, one of
huge.
it's huge. But I suppose and you mentioned yellow rattle, which is, vital in terms of switching from lawn situation to wildflower meadow. I think that in some cases, if you have a lawn that has been kept as a lawn, it's quite difficult to transition to a wildflower meadow, just because, as you said, the seed bank is not there. There's nothing there, only, this 3 or 4 lawn grass species. And in order to transition, you do need the help of something like yellow rattle and other plug plants, anything that will give you a chance to get on top of grass. It can be a difficult transition in people's gardens.
Yeah, I think the transition, you see, because it takes time, they say it's up to 7 years to create a wildflower meadow, and I suppose we're always looking for the instant hit, and it can be hard to wait and have that patience year in, year out. I would always say to somebody, definitely cutting the borders, cutting the meandering pathway through will always help to make that project. And if it is going to take sort of 7 years, it makes that project look more defined and sort of rather than because the first few years can be tricky enough, and it's different whether it's in your garden versus on acres of land, and there's different methods. If you like, I can give you an example of what we've been through the last 7 years with our meadow and the original plot of land.
Yeah.
So when the first thing is that the livestock left the land end of 2017, and it's a very wet meadow. So we left it the first year. The second year, then we got it cut at the end of the season. So it was in September. It was cut and baled, large bales which were taken away. And we then noticed after that, the following spring, definitely more wildflowers coming. We did that for about 3 years, that cut and lift, but because it was really heavy machinery coming on, the tethering process, and then the actual baling, the large bales, they have to be lifted by a forklift. So it makes it harder then if we wanted to use some of those for mulching around trees that we planted. So the year after that, then we found somebody who had a square baler. So it was still heavy machinery for the cutting, the tethering, and then we got a square bale. So we had hundreds of square bales, which meant that, easy to lift when they're dry. Of course, if you leave them on, they're a bit heavy when they're wet, and especially in a wetland area. But we managed to get them all off the land, and again, very useful for mulching around trees and in the sort of polytunnel area with the tree nursery. But we were still very conscious that, it's still really heavy machinery coming onto the land. And when it cuts everything. And, when we've been collecting yellow rattle seed now, we harvest it, in sort of August time. And the amount of life in those buckets, when we collect it by hand, literally down on hands or knees, shaking the seed into buckets. And it is heaving with, with caterpillars, with spiders, with shield bugs, and, absolutely heaving. And I think, so if machinery comes in to do your cutting, all of that is just decimated, including obviously any frogs, because it's wetland, including the frogs that are in there and everything else. So then we said, right, we really want to move away from that. So the following year after that, then we said, right, let's try going back to traditional scything. So we bought a number of scythes. So 4 acres of,
which is a blood sport.
Yeah. And we're certainly not professional.
It's even worse when your own blood.
And we've actually run a scything workshop in collaboration.
Wicklow County.
Yeah, Wicklow County. And which is very interesting.
Yeah, and I would actually, I joke about the scythe, but actually it's a viable thing, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a wonderful way of cutting a wildflower meadow, because it's so, it's so sensitive in relation to the wildlife that's there. You're not crushing everything and decimating everything and baling everything. So, and I often think it's something that, now in fairness, it was difficult in our land because the grass had over a year's growth and so it was heavy. But if you've got a garden, and you get a scythe and you follow the basics on how to use it, you can cut a garden no time with a scythe. And there's no diesel, there's no fumes.
If you keep it up every year.
Yeah.
So before we started scything, there was a gap of a year between the square baling and the scythe. There was a gap, so that makes it extra hard. But again, scything, you're still, there's a lot of work in it, but
it's great.
Yeah, it is. I would recommend it for small areas. It's really not. So of the 4 acres, we managed to get an acre done well, right? But going back to I mentioned earlier about conservation grazing, there's huge benefit to that, because so if you have say cattle on it, certain breeds of cattle are really good for conservation grazing, Dexters or Dremeens, or maybe even the Angus, Aberdeen Angus, and if they're in low density, moving around your pasture, it allows wildlife to be part of that, because obviously as the cows are eating, if there's anything in the way, it'll move out of the way and they'll graze away, and wildflowers will grow. I mean, if you put 100 cattle in the field, they'll eat everything. But if you're small, low density,
I suppose that's for land holding,
for
people
land
you're not going to do that.
You're not going to do that in your garden.
Your terrace garden, or your
no.
this clean head of cattle looking over your fence to your neighbour.
But definitely the scything method, or even a sickle, or to be honest, I've tried it before with the shears. So at the end of, we have a tiny back garden here in Stillorgan, so we could quite happily go with that. Now we mow a pathway through.
We decided that last year. You cut it in half an hour with
you cut it very quickly with scythe. But if somebody didn't feel like, buying a scythe and having that, you do it with the sickle, which is a very small handheld, or you could do it with the shears,
and then obviously the thing is, you take your cuttings away or leave them sit for a while to dry, and any wildflower seed to drop from the heads, and then remove them.
Yeah.
So you're taking nutrients away, obviously, from the soil, denutrifying the soil, giving a chance for the delicate wildflowers to come through.
So
it's interesting.
Options.
It's interesting what you said at the start there, because the wildflower meadow I have, and I speak about it quite a bit. It looks peak for a kind of for a very short window. And that short window is, probably end of May through to sort of end of June, early July. And that's
Yeah.
when it's at its real peak. The oxeye is dominating. Your tall buttercup is dominating. And after that, then it is, in terms of aesthetic, or the what people are perceiving this overall aesthetic to look like. It is it is going downwards from there, but the life in it is unbelievable. So
Unbelievable.
I certainly have my view, and my initial idea for the wildflower meadow was cut out mowing, or a certain amount of mowing, and obviously looking for that aesthetic. And I probably know more than the normal person doing it. I knew I was going to have periods where it wasn't going to look perfect, but the window is quite small, but it has changed for me. The aesthetic, the 6 weeks are lovely, they're a bonus, but it's everything that has happened as a result of that is what has really excited me. As you said, everything from spiders to beetles, every sort of, I don't even know what a lot of them are, but it is just alive all year round,
isn't it? It's just, we notice, I mean, it's a mindset, and I think that's the crucial word. And that applies, I suppose, to a lot of aspects of our gardening, that we just have to allow space for nature. And the days of just those closely cropped billiard table type lawn, and that flower bed that's cleaned nearly like a carpet, where all the materials are taken away in the autumn. I mean, that like in the countryside, that green field sward that's of lush green perennial or ryegrass that's cut 3 times a year for silage. They're both of those are deserts for biodiversity. I mean, you do fall in love. I mean, our meadow is the same. The wet wildflower meadow, it's a riot of color. In the spring, with cardamine potensis, with cuckoo flower and creeping buttercup, and then it goes on, and you look at it as the summer goes on, it takes on a golden hue with the grasses. But even then, we get a bit of knapweed then coming through towards later in the season, and the devil's bit scabious,
Beautiful.
But nature tells you what's right and what's wrong, and we look at the swallows, hunting over the field, hoovering up the insects. And as you just said, you look at what's beneath the sward. You see all the shield bugs and the caterpillars and the spiders, and it's just mind blowing, the life that's in there. It really is.
But actually, going back to the aesthetics, I'm kind of looking out at our patch there in the small garden, and right now, so I think it looks great now. The sun is shining, so that's an advantage. But right now, you can see there's lots of dandelion in bloom.
There's oxeye daisy.
Got loads of cowslip, actually. So cowslip, it started off a few years ago at the back garden, just one plant of it, and now this year I can see there's at least 7 or 8 cowslip clumps. And so they're in bloom right now. And then
there's a lot coming
through. The plantain, it looks good as well.
Yarrow, there's oxeye daisy, yarrow.
Coming through that will replace that will be, oxeye daisy and yarrow and knapweed. And so you can actually have from spring right through to autumn that succession planting, that people, like if you were doing formal borders, that people plan for that. But you can do the same with native wildflowers.
There's figworts down the bottom. Figwort's a really interesting plant. It is. Wasps absolutely adore it.
Love it.
And I know when you say wasps, most people, they'll balk and they'll think, but there's a great example of how we need to just really reconnect with I mean, wasps are so important, in relation to the niche they fill in the ecosystem, in the control of other insects. That word pests, I think, is a terrible word. I mean, but they'll control the likes of green flies and black flies.
I want to go back to the aesthetics because I'm looking out at the card chair, and I just want to
be around here.
I wanted to mention another idea, just that obviously we do the cut and lift in the autumn, but we do leave areas where we don't cut and lift. So say, for example, right now I'm looking at these lovely tall knapweed seed heads that obviously there's no seed in them any longer, but you have the stalk and the dried flower head. And it's standing up tall when everything else is kind of more low growing at the moment, like the dandelion and cowslip. And actually I love the dandelion clocks, when they go to seed. I think they look very pretty as well.
And the goldfinch love them, and the house sparrows were eating money yesterday. I was looking at
the actual the remnants of last year's knapweed looks very aesthetically pleasing in amongst that, you know.
For
So you
sure.
can,
In terms of in terms of the podcast, I had Sandra Cafola on. It was one of the first episodes, or one of the early episodes back in 2020.
Yeah, yeah,
And so Sandra is genius in wildflowers. But
yeah, yeah.
one of his in that podcast, there's a line that just keeps coming back to me all the time. So somebody questioned him and said, "There's no color in the wildflower meadow in the winter." And he
Mm.
said, "What do you mean there's no color? You have the goldfinches, the bullfinches, and
Yes, yes,
it's a
yes.
perception thing. So there's no flower, or no flower of mention, but there is all these seed heads there. And a
Mm.
great example again is the knapweed out the front of my house. So you'll have the goldfinches, and they'll be hanging off
Yeah,
it. It'll be bent like a fishing rod, and
yeah,
the goldfinches are just hanging there eating the seed heads. And
yeah,
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 it's
yeah.
just
It's just
amazing to
so.
see that. But it is a
There's,
perception change, because in the eye of, if you're looking at it versus the postcard of a fully
mm,
fledged in-flower meadow, it looks like it's gone over, that it isn't
yeah,
overly beautiful.
mm,
But when you see a goldfinch, as I say, hanging off the head of a
yeah,
knapweed, there's nothing more
yeah,
beautiful. But it's just
exactly.
it's a different beautiful.
And also, maybe I think if we got active in that environment at that time of year as well, it would help. So, say, as well as the goldfinch being able to feed off the seed, that if we collected the seed by hand, so again, that the seed that is in our area is more suited to the land of the area. So, ideally, if we were all collecting it, and it gets you connected with that autumn nature by
Hmm.
doing that, collecting the seed, and then learning how to then propagate that on into plug plants to
Yeah.
then plant out in your own
mm.
garden, so that you're not actually having to necessarily go out and buy wildflower seeds, that you're actually generating that yourself,
It can be done. I mean, a great
Yeah.
example, which we did actually only the last couple of weeks, actually, which we're all learning every day. And one was cardamom pretensis, cuckoo flower, lady smock, which is, again, you talk about the interdependency between our flora and our fauna, and how important native plants are, as opposed to, us filling completely our gardens with non-native plants. The orange tip butterflies now, which are out in force at Wildacres, and they're sole larval food plant. Well, also hedge mustard, but their main larval food plant is cardamom pretensis, cuckoo flower. And we actually only just found out there a couple of weeks ago, you can propagate that from leaf cuttings. And all you do is get a whole load of leaf cuttings, put them in a Ziploc bag with some rainwater, leave them in the sunlight, and they'll all root. And we
Oh,
just have we have some of them in about 100 of them in a Ziploc bag here on the windowsill. They've all sent out these thread-like roots, so they can all be propagated into individual plants.
oh,
So it is
yeah,
fascinating, all these things, all these
yeah, for
ways of
sure.
propagating.
I'm conscious that we're sort of heading
Oh yeah, yeah.
towards the end, but one thing I want to go back to, and I know you have workshops on this, but the wildlife ponds. So tell us about
Mm.
those. And
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We could. Okay. Have we got another 3 hours or 4 hours?
I have, but I don't know, have you guys got 3 hours?
No. Yeah. I know. Yeah. 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 Oh, they're just dynamite. They are just, in a nutshell. I mean, we planted thousands of native trees, and we've our tree nursery. And I always think that, an oak tree, first 300 years is classed as juvenile, next 300 years middle aged, and last 300 years veteran. And so you plant trees in a way for the next generation. A woodland, but you dig a wildlife pond, and wildlife will find sometimes within hours, because a lot of the incredible, fascinating creatures that you're going to get in your wildlife ponds, diving beetles of various different species, water scorpions, water stick insects, water boatmen, they can all fly. And they all find that water habitat, that newly dug habitat or created wildlife ponds. They'll fly at night to avoid predation. They pick up the glint of starlight and moonlight on a water surface, and that's how they find new habitats. But water just attracts in so much biodiversity.
I mean, all life needs water, so it sort of it makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. And we need them. They're so relaxing
yeah,
to have in your outdoor
what's
space.
that saying that a garden without a pond is like a theater without a stage?
God, that's very
Yeah.
eloquently, really.
So, I didn't make that up myself.
I would put it a bit more basically than that.
Yeah, that's
But like it's a bit like the fireplace in a living room. It's that center stage that a wildlife pond. And again, because you want them to be located in a sunny area, so they're not hidden away in the corner. They are actually become the center stage.
You put them somewhere that you can see them, as we always recommend to people.
Like the fire, we all gather around the fire. It's like the same, a pond, everything comes to it. The birds will come in to drink and to bathe, and to feed, obviously, for insects over the ponds. You'll find
I mean, we've 57 ponds at Wildacres, but we've one small pond here in our garden. So remember we were saying there, in the space of 2 hours there last summer during one of the hot spells, we counted 11 different bird species came into the pond just to drink and to bathe. So they're just such a haven for wildlife. And there's, I mean, what, on a day like today, and it's a beautiful day, to be able to sit out if we had the time with a cup of tea and a deck chair and sit by the pond. It's so relaxing. Let's try it sometime.
So speaking of ponds and the creation of ponds, so workshops are a big theme of what you guys do. And I know one of the workshops is how to create your own wildlife ponds. So maybe talk us through some of the workshops. I know you've good few upcoming, so tell us about some of those.
So for May, like May's a busy month as well for us. So we do a honey tour. I'll give you an example. So we do have an apiary down at Wildacres, a small number of hives. Again, we don't want to flood the land with honeybees. But it's a small number of hives, and we're producing honey sustainably, because it's important that we're able to produce food in our country, but it's how we produce this is key. So the honey tour is really it's a relaxing, sort of immersive morning, learning about the importance of, before we think about having hives, that it's about what are the plants that are around. So the hedgerow full of flowering plants, and the ground flora, that there's enough food for the honeybees, but also all the other bee species, the bumblebees and solitary bees, that are so important. And they're the ones actually that are threatened at the moment in terms of population and species. So the honey tour is lovely, relaxing, focus on how honey is produced by our wonderful native Irish honeybee, and then how we would bring that from hive into jar. But we do talk a lot about biodiversity and about native plants, whether it's trees, whether it's hedgerow, whether it's bramble. I mean, people curse bramble, but it's one of the most important plants for
a lot of the plants we've been talking about are the most important for biodiversity. Brambles and nettles and ryegrass, they're all incredible. Docks,
So the honey tour is really, it's about producing food sustainably and in tune with nature, and a lot about biodiversity. It's a lovely relaxing morning. The guided nature experience then is just that. It's about that immersion in nature for a few hours through the nature reserve, but also showing, we do a lot of biodiversity monitoring. So we take trail camera footage, take a lot of photographs, some aerial stuff as well. And so we have that to show people in presentation format, because on the day itself, depending on the season, you'll see certain creatures out, but you won't see everything. So, whether it's the red kite
or the
overhead, or the woodpeckers, or the kingfisher fishing on the main pond, all of these things we're able to show people through an audiovisual presentation, as well as doing the guided tour around the nature reserve, which I have to say, every day seems to be sunny when we're doing our events. We're very lucky with the weather. There's always tea and coffee and bickies as well. And then we have a gardening for biodiversity workshop too. And that's more focused on people who love gardening, have gardens, but want to do more to bring more nature into that environment. So it's a lovely immersive experience, covering anything from ponds to native hedgerow, to pollinator beds and wildflower lawns. And then of course the ponds workshop, biggie. That's it. That's a huge one. That's the one that sells out the quickest.
So on that one, people learn how to create a wildlife pond in their garden, and they can scale it up or down depending on the size of the garden.
Yeah, depend. I mean, we have, as I said, 57 ponds, and we've one which is the size of a football pitch, and everything in between, right the way down to a micro pond
Yeah.
made from a recycled flower bucket. So that somebody could put on a balcony, for instance. So we cover the whole topic of ponds as to how you build them, of every size, how you maintain them. We show people the wildlife that they bring in. And just covers it from start to finish.
Yeah, from garden ponds to countryside ponds, everything in between, and ponds that will be lined, ponds that don't need to be lined.
How to check, do you actually have to have, or do you need a liner in the first place, and where to site them,
how to manage them,
so,
how to track the biodiversity in them, the pond dips, and enjoy the wonderful creatures. So every aspect.
And we get lots of people people tend to love it, and they send us in pictures then months later of ponds they've created. So it's great.
We love to get the photos afterwards.
I imagine that's very satisfying.
It is.
For sure. And so I know you're adding workshops all the time, and there's workshops through a lot of the months of the year. So I will put the link to in the show notes, where people can find all these different workshops, and you'll see the future ones coming up and all that. Before we sort of round off, I mentioned, listeners of the podcast are probably sick of me talking about it. Two very exciting things happened in a garden setting here. I got the bullfinches in for the first time last year, which I know for some people is not exciting because they're widespread in certain places, but we never had them here. So to get them in was brilliant. And then just before Christmas, we got the woodpecker in. And so a friend of mine a couple of years ago who only lives about 3 miles away, he saw one on his bird feeder, sent me a picture of it, and it was a woodpecker. But I definitely hadn't seen any here. And then just around Christmas time, every day for about a week, I saw a woodpecker in the garden, and that was very exciting for me.
Brilliant.
But for you guys on the scale that you're at, what have been the most exciting things that have happened?
I would say,
that's it.
I would say just of course, there is some standout moments, obviously when the otters
in January.
The otter every day in January on our main wildlife pond, which is very unusual. We had a dog otter coming up and hunting through just in broad daylight, foraging in the pond. So we actually got some incredible footage where, because his eyesight wasn't that great, we were able to walk down in front of it. And it was literally about 3-4 foot away from the camera. And it was there scratching itself, rolling over like a dog on the grass. And then you could see every now and then it would sense that there's something there, and would look up and smell, but the wind was in the right direction. So this went on for about 3-4 minutes. And then eventually, went into the pond and was foraging around looking for frogs and dragonfly nymphs, and then eventually just twigged there was something there, went off. But I would say overall, just the pleasure of seeing nature rebound, from what was a desert, seeing biodiversity coming back. And that's because it's hard work, I'll be honest with you, and it can be depressing work, in relation to the overall scale of things. So it is. I mean, just, when you look at the trends, in relation to biodiversity loss, and you see the headlines, it can be quite disheartening at times. But on the plus side, definitely there is a major swing towards the want to restore biodiversity in Ireland.
Yeah, I'd say as well as the biodiversity returning, the people that come to us are amazing. So everybody that's come is just so lovely. And I'm not just saying that, so we started, this is the start of our 4th year doing workshops and tours and events. And I have to say, everybody has just been lovely, because people who want to take action for nature just tend to have that really good heart. They want to take action and do something and learn what they can do. So that's really
no, it is.
That's very heartening. And there's a lot more people taking action.
That's definitely the plus.
For sure. And I understand what you're saying in that it can be depressing if you look at the overall broader picture, and you feel against the face of that, or we feel as individuals in the face of that we're looking up a really, really steep cliff, and it's hard to move the needle. But it is incredible, the compounding interest of small small projects and
huge.
small steps, and
Immense.
multiplied across many gardens, across many
Yeah.
farms, across many situations like yourselves, how that compounds and
Yeah.
changes the direction, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I
actually,
can feel that.
that's
I can
yeah.
definitely feel that
Actually,
happening
and
now.
that's one thing we'd like to just stress as well. I mean, you said it there so perfectly, but just to add to it, everybody, that's, in relation to the biodiversity crisis, especially, everybody can have a huge impact. I mean, if you've got an outdoor space of any size and you create a little pocket of habitat and somebody 2, 3, 4 doors up does the same and someone else does the same, you're creating that wonderful thing, connectivity in the landscape and all these pockets of habitat. So wildlife can move throughout the landscape from your garden to the next garden 3 doors up and on and on and on. And that has a massive positive impact, even apart from our well-being, which is we talked about, which is huge.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
I was just going to say the woodpeckers were a highlight for us too, by the way.
And still are.
Yeah.
Hang a peanut feeder out in your garden, one of the rigid mesh ones in the winter, and if they're there, they'll be in.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I have to say that one. I looked out. It was a bit of a shock. So it was early one morning, making breakfast, and the next day I looked out, and it was just such a shock. And then
What the hell?
to come back for 4 or 5 days in a row, and I was just delighted.
Isn't
Now,
it?
I haven't seen them just recently, and I'm not overly worried about that. But I think
no, they'll be there.
the fact that they're on the move towards our direction, I think I'm
they're actually, that's a good news story. They're actually doing very well.
I think they've been recorded.
They're recorded in every county, and they recolonized back there about 20 years especially on the East Coast, into Glen of the Downs, and now they've spread. So that's a good news story.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Really interested to get up and see your place during the year, and
look forward to
it. Sounds amazing, looks amazing. It's a really good story. Congratulations and well done on what you've achieved so far.
John.
But by the sounds of both of you, you're definitely not stopping. You're pushing and developing further. And you can hear the enthusiasm from yourselves. So it's phenomenal.
Well, thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Yeah.
Honestly, you're very good.
It's really lovely to be a part of this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
So huge thanks to Gilly and Brian for coming on. For any of you listening and watching, you can feel and see the enthusiasm, from the two of them, the work that's been done there, the effort to change the needle, I guess, in terms of what's happening is there for all to see. Those workshops, all the various ones, there's hugely beneficial information for people to take and implement in their own gardens, and even from an awareness piece to engage with Wildacres and become aware of what's happening and the changes that are happening out there, I think is hugely important. I'll put the link for the courses and the website and so on in the show notes, but definitely check them out. It's a phenomenal place. I heard about it from Rosie May, the insomniac gardener. She had been to visit, and she said it was a fabulous place and really worth going to. So that's where I heard about it, but it's certainly worth checking out for yourselves. Check out the courses, check out the visit if you can, and so on. So that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.